That's Adonai. Adonai is typically translated as Lord. Note capital L and then lowercase O-R-D. So, for example, the call of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 6. And I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? And who will go for us? And while the Hebrew Elohim, God, appears over 2,500 times in the Old Testament, Adonai is not as prominent. It's 450 times. But then there is the third name, and that's really distinctive and unique. And that is in Hebrew, Yahweh. Now that's translated in the English, your English Bibles. Now look at the difference between Adonai, Lord, and Yahweh, Lord. You see how they're all caps? Yahweh appears over 6,800 times in the Old Testament. For example, Psalm 23, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd. In other words, in the Hebrew, it's Yahweh is my shepherd. Now, what's interesting that over time, the name Yahweh was so sacred that they stopped saying it. So at the time of Jesus, that was a name you could not utter. So when they would be reading what we call the Old Testament at Jesus' time, that was scripture, when they'd come to the name Yahweh, they would automatically read Adonai, even though it's Yahweh in Hebrew. So throughout the session, when it's Yahweh, I'll try to typically render my translation of the Hebrew as Adonai. Now, in the Old Testament, there are three human characters that stand out more than any other human character. The first is Abraham, Abraham the patriarch. We don't know exactly for sure when Abraham lived. There's various dating, but probably somewhere around the year 2000 BCE. In other words, 2,000 years before Jesus. Abraham the patriarch was alive. And of course, Abraham's such a distinctive figure, because it is God who chose Abraham to be the father of the nation. The second big figure in the Old Testament, of course, is Moses. Moses, the lawgiver, lived sometime around the year 1300 BCE. Abraham appears actually not that much from Genesis 12 to Genesis 25. But after Abraham died, regularly God identifies God's self as the God of Abraham. Moses, however, Moses gets 5 books, or 4 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The third figure that is prominent is King David, and that's who we're going to be looking at. King David ruled approximately for 40 years, according to the Old Testament, from the year 1000 to the year 960 BCE. And we're going to discover David's story from 1 Samuel through 2 Samuel, and then the first 2 chapters of the book of Kings. Where we need to pick up the story is the transition from the book of Judges to the book of 1 Samuel. Now, throughout the book of Judges, so this is the period between Moses and David, throughout the book of Judges, Israel continually went through a cyclical pattern. First, they would lack solid leadership. There was no distinct way of who is going to lead Israel. And because of the lack of leadership, Israel would fall into idolatry. They'd worship the gods of their neighbors. And that idolatry then led to God handing Israel over to their enemies. So lack of leadership leads to idolatry, leads to God handing them over to their enemies. Then Israel would cry out to the Lord, would cry out to God for deliverance. And then God would raise up a faithful judge to lead Israel in triumph over its enemies and away from idolatry. But then what happened? After the victory, the judge would lead Israel until the judge died. And guess what? Lack of leadership, and the whole pattern goes again and again. So that's a pattern throughout the book of Judges. The last 3 chapters of Judges are really bad. I mean, it's bad. How bad? You get rape, you get murder, and a near genocidal war where the tribes of Israel are turning on each other and slaughtering each other. And so the book of Judges ends on a dark, desperate note. And the very last line of the book of Judges seems to present the problem. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, Israel doesn't have consistent, solid leadership, and it just goes to hell in a handbasket. Now, as 1 Samuel opens, Israel is leading a marginalized existence. They're marginalized, meaning they're on the outs, and it's mainly because of the power and the pressure of the Philistines. Israel, though, is also in moral chaos. So the story begins at the point when there seems to be no future for Israel. Instead, there's only hopelessness. And then, in a rather shocking move, the story doesn't begin with the great men. It doesn't begin, and then God raised up David. Instead, it begins with the story of a bullied, barren woman named Hannah. And Hannah, in many ways, symbolizes Israel. Bullied, barren, no future. So Hannah's story, I just want to look at a few facets of Hannah's story because it's so interesting that the biblical narrative goes to the ultimate margins. A bullied, barren woman, not a great heroic man to save them. Hannah's married to a man named Elkanah. Elkanah has another wife, because in the Old Testament, that's not unusual. And her name is Peninnah. Now, here's Hannah's dilemma. She's barren. In fact, in chapter 1, verse 6 of 1 Samuel, it says, Yahweh had closed her womb. Doesn't say why, just says Yahweh had closed her womb. And remember, that's in a society where a woman's status is based not so much on to whom she's married, rather it's to the children, especially what gender children? Sons. That's her status. Well, Hannah's barren. Even worse, Peninnah has provided Elkanah with children. And Peninnah would torment Hannah because she was barren. So we hear a couple verses after we're told that she was barren, we hear, therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. So Hannah is at the margins. Hannah is a powerless person. Hannah is derided. by her husband's other wife. And then we hear Hannah rose and presented herself before Yahweh. Now, Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of Yahweh. She was deeply distressed and prayed to Yahweh and wept bitterly. She vowed a vow. O Yahweh of the armies, if only you'll look on the misery of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a male child, then I will give him to you. So, in other words, Hannah is proposing a reciprocal giving. If God gives her a male child, she will give that male child to God. And so we hear, as Hannah was before Yahweh, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli the priest thought she was drunk. So Eli said to her, how long will you make a drunken spectacle of yourself? Put away your wine. She can't even get any satisfaction when she goes to pray. But Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman deeply troubled. I've drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I've been pouring out my soul before Yahweh. Then Eli answered, go in peace. The God of Israel grant the asking you asked of him. And she said, let your servant find favor in your sight. Then they went back to their house at Ramah. Elkanah knew his wife Hannah, and Yahweh remembered her. And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she named him Samuel. For she said, I have asked of Yahweh. But remember her vow. So they brought the child to Eli, and she said, oh, my Lord, as you live, my Lord, I'm the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to Yahweh. For this child I prayed, and Yahweh has granted me the petition that I made to him. Therefore, I have lent him to Yahweh as long as he lives. He is lent to Yahweh. And she left it there for Yahweh. So Hannah turned to Yahweh in despair, prayed for a son, vowed to lend her son to Yahweh. Yahweh remembered Hannah's plight. She bore a son, and Hannah faithfully fulfills her vow and lends her son to Yahweh. So in this story of Hannah, the narrative is showing us that new life, a new future comes from Yahweh, even when there seems to be no possibilities. And the proper response to Yahweh creating new futures is ongoing faithfulness to Yahweh. So in the person of Hannah, that's what Israel is to do, to turn and trust and pray to Yahweh, that Yahweh will give a new future to Israel, and Israel is to be faithful because of it. And then chapter 2 of First Samuel, we get Hannah's song. Now, in the Old Testament, no, in the Bible, there are 4 songs sung by women. They celebrate God's incredible victorious reversals, especially on behalf of the downtrodden. The first song is in Exodus 15. Miriam, Moses' sister, right after they cross the sea, they celebrate their deliverance by God, and Miriam sings about the reversals that God has overthrown the mighty. The second song is Deborah. Deborah was a judge. Deborah, through her encouragement, her general Barak defeated the Canaanites, who had superior technology, superior forces. And so in Judges 5, Deborah celebrates God's incredible reversing victory. And then Hannah in 2 Samuel chapter 2. And you know who the fourth one is? Yes, Mary, the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, about God is pulling down the mighty and uplifting the poor. So the opening of Hannah's song. Then Hannah prayed and said, my heart exults in Yahweh. My horn is exalted, Yahweh. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in your victory. For there's none holy like Yahweh. For there is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. So the fact that she's been given a son, lent her son back to Yahweh, but she sings in triumph. Hannah's pure joy lies in Yahweh's unsurpassed power and supremacy. And so in verses 3 to 9 in 1 Samuel chapter 2, Hannah celebrates several divine reversals. Weakness is turned into strength. The lowly are exalted. The hungry are filled. The poor are enriched. The barren are given children. Some years ago, I taught a master's degree course, advanced course, over the seminary in Philadelphia. So I lived in Philadelphia for a week, and I taught on Luke. And one of the people in my class was an old rabbi from the DC area. He was getting his master's in sacred theology at a Lutheran seminary. And so I'm doing very first day, I'm doing chapter 1 of Luke, and we hit the Magnificat. And so I read, and I have on the screen the Magnificat, and the old rabbi says, my God, that's Hannah's song. Yes, Luke borrowed from 1 Samuel 2. So Mary's song and Hannah's song are very, very, very close together. But then Hannah's song ends on a really strange note. Last verse. Yahweh shatters his adversaries. Against them, he'll thunder in heaven. Yahweh will judge the ends of the earth. He'll give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. What doesn't Israel have at this point? A king. But here, this woman so celebrates God's reversals. She sees into the future. Now, especially end of Judges, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their eyes. But she says, Yahweh will give strength to Yahweh's king. So Hannah, the woman who Yahweh remembered, the woman who celebrates Yahweh's victorious reversals, seems to know Yahweh is gonna have a king. But the narrative is taking its time. It doesn't rush away to kingship. Instead, it focuses now on Hannah's son that she gave to Yahweh. So now Samuel. And Samuel's a really interesting figure because Samuel is this transition. Samuel is the very last judge in Israel. But Samuel is also the very first prophet in Israel. So the narrative now is going to focus on Samuel. So on the one hand, it seems that the pattern of judges is about to be repeated because the narrative tells us Eli's sons are sinful scoundrels. On the other hand, Samuel becomes a new alternative both for Yahweh and Israel. So just when you think the pattern of Judges is going to be repeated, that Elihu's priest and judge is old, his sons are corrupt, and geez, that's going to lead Israel into idolatry. Samuel now is chosen and called by Yahweh. So Eli was old. He kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings with all these people. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against Yahweh, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of Yahweh to put them to death. Very next line. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with Yahweh and also the people. So Eli and his house, Yahweh's going to wipe them out. But Yahweh's got Samuel. Now Yahweh came and stood there, calling as before. So this is Samuel's just a boy. But Yahweh is calling him in the middle of the night. Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. Then Yahweh said to Samuel, see, I'm about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hear it tingle. On that day, I will fulfill against Eli that which I spoke concerning his house from the beginning to the end. For I've told him that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God and he didn't restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. And as Samuel grew up, Yahweh was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of Yahweh. Yahweh continued to appear at Shiloh, for Yahweh revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of Yahweh. And the word of Samuel came to all Israel. So it says, when all Israel from Dan to Beersheba, Dan is a city on the far, far north. To this day, you can visit the ancient ruins of Dan, and you can look north and see Lebanon. And Beersheba was the city that's farthest south. So essentially, the narrative is saying from the north to the south, everybody knew Samuel's word. And Samuel, notice, is identified for the first time here as the prophet. Okay, so this is 1 Samuel 3. You think, okay, let's get David. No, not yet. The narrative's just going to take its time. So instead, we move to 1 Samuel 4 to 6, the Ark narrative. Yes, this is Indiana Jones' Ark. This is the Ark of the Covenant. And according to the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant, I mean, Israel's been dragging that thing around for 40 years in the wilderness. Inside the Ark were the tablets with the 10 Commandments written on them. And it was thought, the top of the Ark, you've got two cherubim. That's the earthly throne for Yahweh. Yahweh exists above the Ark. So the Ark is the throne of God. So 1 Samuel 4 to 6 shifts the focus of the narrative away from Samuel. In fact, Samuel isn't even mentioned in those 3 chapters. Instead, it wants to focus on the unseen but powerful hand of God. In fact, the hand of Yahweh, that expression appears over 10 times in those 3 chapters. So it starts out, I'm going to tell you the story briefly. The Philistines decimate Israel in battle, and the Philistines, their mortal enemies, capture the Ark of the Covenant, which is Yahweh's throne on earth. So the enemy has got the most sacred thing in all Israel. Eli's 2 sons die in battle against the Philistines. And when Eli hears the news about the terrible defeat, the death of his sons, and especially the capture of the ark, he's sitting down, he falls backwards, breaks his neck, and he dies. So Yahweh's prophecy about the death of Eli and his sons is fulfilled. Now, the Philistines, meanwhile, they treat the ark as a war trophy. So they take the ark and they put it in the town of Ashdod. They put it in the temple of Dagon. Dagon was the head Philistine god. And so by having the ark in the temple of Dagon, the Philistines are saying, our God beat your God. Ha, ha, ha. But there's the unseen, powerful hand of Yahweh. The very next morning, the morning after they put the Ark of the Covenant in Dagon's temple, they go in and see Dagon, the Hebrew says, fell on his face. Well, their God's on his face. We got to get Dagon's statue back up. So they put Dagon's statue back up. Then they come back the next morning. And not only is Dagon's statue back on the ground, his head's cut off and his arms and hands are cut off, symboling Yahweh has triumphed over Dagon. Don't mess with Yahweh. So we hear 1 Samuel 5. The hand of Yahweh, there's that phrase, was heavy against the people of Ashdod. That's where the ark was. He terrified and afflicted them with tumors. Now, some translations actually read the Hebrew as he afflicted them with hemorrhoids. Both Ashdod and its territory. And then the men of Ashdod saw how things were, and they said, the ark of God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God. So the Philistines passed the ark around to the major cities in Philistia. But everywhere they take the ark, the hand of Yahweh is against the Philistine population. And they too are struck with tumors, or some translations, hemorrhoids. After 7 months of this pattern, the Philistines finally get wise. They return the Ark of the Covenant to Israel, and they include with it 5 golden tumors, or 5 golden hemorrhoids, and 5 golden mice. And they offer that as a guilt offering to Yahweh. In other words, we never should have messed with your ark. Sorry about that. Have some golden tumors and some golden hemorrhoids and some golden mice. The ark ends up in mothballs in the house of an Israelite named Abinadab in the town of Kiriath Jearim, because it seems too dangerous for either the Philistines or the Israelites to handle. When the Philistines give the ark back, some men don't respect the ark, Israelite men, and they're struck dead too. So essentially they put it in mothballs, saying, hey, no, we can't handle the ark. Can't remember the ark for years is in mothballs at the house of Abinadab, because down the road, we're going to revisit that. Well, down the road, the biblical narrative will revisit it. And then chapter 7 returns to Samuel. And Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you're returning to Yahweh with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Asherots among you, and direct your heart to Yahweh and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So the people of Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtarots, and they served Yahweh only. So Ashtarots was the statue of the female Canaanite god. And this is the one where the agrarian theology of the Canaanites. Okay. The growing season is over. The fields are fallow. Okay. Now it comes time for planting. The Canaanite theology is Baal is a fertility god. Okay. Rain god. But how do we get Baal to wake up and make it rain? God, he's got to have intercourse with his goddess, Ashtaroth. And so what you do is the farmers would go to the temple of Baal, have sexual intercourse with the temple prostitutes. Baal gets a little, ooh, hey, that looks good. And so then he goes in to his mistress and has intercourse with her, and then the rain comes. How'd you like to be an ag agent there? That's pretty. So Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life, and he went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Mitzpah. He judged Israel in all these places. Then he'd return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there he also judged Israel. He built an altar to Yahweh, and when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel. The name of his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, that's the town in the south. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after profit. They took bribes and they perverted justice. See the same old problem? Samuel's old. He puts his sons as judges, but his sons are corrupt. Oh, crud. Same old pattern. And so now the elders of Israel have a new idea. So chapter 8. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together, came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, look, you're old. Your sons did not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. They've not rejected you, they've rejected me from being king over them, according to all the deeds that they have done. From the day I brought them out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they're also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So on the one hand, the elders would be the richest, most powerful people in the given tribes. The elders' assessment of the situation is accurate. They point out, Sam, you're old. Your sons are corrupt. And on the other hand, their solution is really radical. Give us a king. Israel, they say, give us a king, appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. The whole problem here, though, is Israel is not like the other nations. Israel isn't like the other nations because God has given Israel a unique identity and a unique way of life. So in other words, the Israelites want to blend in and be like their neighbors. But God made them an elect nation, a distinct nation. So the elders of Israel want to conform to the patterns of other nations, and in so doing, they are forfeiting their God-given identity, their God-given particularity, what makes them distinct. Surprisingly, though, God immediately grants the elders' demand. And in fact, he repeats to Samuel the command to listen to them. He starts out, God says, obey the voice of the people. And then at the end, obey their voice. But at the same time, God recognizes the idolatry behind their request. It's idolatry because they're rejecting God's royal sovereignty over God's chosen people. So the issue is not political or judicial. That's what the elders think. The elders are thinking in terms of politics and justice. The issue, however, is mainly theological. In other words, what the biblical narrative is reminding us is that decisions about power are also decisions about God. And that becomes an important theological point for the rest of the entire Bible. Decisions about power are decisions about God. In fact, that's in the book of Revelation in many ways, that's the main issue. It's decisions about power are decisions about God. So while God didn't squelch their request, but gave its permission, not necessarily approval, God will also make sure that through Samuel, the elders of Israel will be given God's warning about the ways and the means of kingship, who will rule over them. So Samuel told all the words of Yahweh to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He'll take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be horsemen and to run before his chariots. He'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground, to reap his harvest, to make his implements of war, and the equipment of his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He'll take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and servants. He'll take your male servants and female servants, the best of your young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks. You shall be his slaves, and in that day you'll cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but Yahweh will not answer. I mean, look at the refrain. These are the ways of the king. He will take, he will appoint, he'll take, he'll take, he'll take, he'll take, he'll take. So Samuel is telling him monarchy exists for monarchy. Monarchy lives by confiscation for its own ends. You want it? This is what you're going to get. So in essence, by choosing monarchy, Israel is not only rejecting God, Israel is choosing to go to its former status in Egypt. They were slaves. Only now their master will not be Pharaoh. The master, their master, will be the very own king that they have demanded. And in Egypt, when they were slaves to Pharaoh, the monarch, they cried out to God, and God remembered them and delivered them. And look what God is saying. Not this time. Nope. You ask for it. Here's your punishment. I'm going to give you exactly what you want. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there should be a king over us, and that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. And when Samuel heard all these words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Samuel, obey their voice, make them a king. And Samuel then said to the men of Israel, go, every man to his city. So the people repeat their demand. They want to be like all the other nations. Likewise, they continue to see monarchy as a military and judicial issue. They don't see it as a theological issue, and that's going to be a big mistake in their history. They also fail to realize that it was Yahweh who had single-handedly defeated the Philistines. And that's where that ark story comes right back here. They want a king to go fight for them. Yahweh fights for them. They don't need a king. In the end, both Samuel and the elders don't have any good options for a broken system of leadership. Samuel has corrupt sons. The elders demand a corrupt system. So while the people refuse to obey Samuel, Yahweh tells Samuel to obey the voice of the people and to make them a king. Yahweh not only lets Israel choose its leadership, but leaves Israel to the fate of its choice. Samuel remains reluctant to the idea of kingship. And so instead of immediately making preparations to find and install a king, he dismisses each man to their own city. And that recalls the very end of Judges. There was no king. Each man did what was right in their own sight. But Samuel is obedient, if nothing else, so he's going to anoint the king. Now, the day before Saul came, Yahweh had revealed to Samuel, tomorrow about this time, I'll send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you'll anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. He'll save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have seen my people because their cry has come to me. When Samuel saw Saul, Yahweh told him, here's the man of whom I spoke to you. He's the one who shall restrain my people. Then Samuel took a flask of oil, poured it on his head, kissed him, and said, has not Yahweh anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And he shall reign over the people of Yahweh, and you will save them from the hand of your surrounding enemies. So that the pouring on of oil, that's the anointing. And that's a ritual that they would perform for the next 400 years. When the new king begins his reign, they anoint him with oil. And in Hebrew, anointed one is Messiah. Okay? So in the Old Testament, the kings were the anointed ones. The kings were the Messiah. And the Greek version of anointed one, Christos. So that's where we get Christ, anointed one. So Samuel's anointing of Saul to be king here, strictly a private affair. It's Yahweh, it's Samuel, it's Saul. That's all. Though having a king over Israel was definitely not Yahweh's choice. Who will be anointed king over Israel is Yahweh's exclusive choice. And it's Saul. Saul is the first king. And note, Israel remains Yahweh's people, even though Israel will now have their own king. So while Yahweh won't hear Israel's cry for being oppressed by their king, Yahweh does hear Israel's cry for being oppressed by the Philistines. And Yahweh sees King Saul as the solution to Yahweh's oppression. So in chapter 9 of 1 Samuel, there is a private anointing. No one else knows that Saul is king. In chapter 10, we'll look just at this one for a second. There. Then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clan of Matarites was taken by Lot. And Saul, the son of Kish, was taken by Lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of Yahweh, is there a man yet to come? And Yahweh said, look, he's hidden himself among the baggage. Then they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was head and shoulders taller than any of the people. And Samuel said to all the people, do you see him who Yahweh has chosen? There's none like him among the people. And all the people shouted, long live the king. So whereas the previous anointing of Samuel was strictly private, here is the very public presentation. Saul is the divine choice for king. And it's including when you're using lots, that's God's choice. And then twice Yahweh discloses. Despite Saul's reluctance, Saul will be king. So look at this. We got 4 sessions on the story of David. Who hasn't even appeared? David. Because the biblical story wants to tell the story of David, especially in light of Hannah, in light of Samuel, and in light of Saul, the first king. So where we'll pick it up next week is we'll look at Saul's kingship and then how David is brought on the scene, even while Saul's still king. So we'll leave it there. We'll see you next week. Oh, thank you.